Okay, so welcome along everybody to Dublin TEFL Open with Jason Anderson. It's customary, of course, to say something like, here's someone who needs no introduction, and then launch into a lengthy one. I won't do that. I mean, if you've made it this far, you will have seen the blurb, hopefully, on the website. You've heard about Jason, or you know him personally and have come to heckle. So thanks very much for joining us, Jason. Very much looking forward to the session today. I'll hand straight over to you.
Thank you very much, Sean. Thank you very much for inviting me to do this talk. Thank you to Dublin TEFL for sponsoring it. And thank you to everybody for coming. We've got a really nice group of people. I can see so many familiar names from different parts of the world. Got some of my colleagues from India here. I can see, hello Deepika, hello Koheli. Lots of colleagues from CELTA trainers as well. Great to see that. And I'll kind of make some reference. You'll see hopefully relevance for things like CELTA, Delta, DIP TESOL, CERT TESOL training, and also some of the Dublin TEFL students I can see here as well. Great. Right. So as Sean mentioned, the talk today is called Contemporary Lesson Planning Frameworks in TESOL. And I'll go over in a moment exactly what I mean about that, what I'm referring to. But first of all, just to double check, can you all see the slides okay? Is that sharing okay? Feel free to just type something, or Sean's nodding. Sean's confident. Yeah. Great. Excellent, great. Okay, so before I start off, great, thank you. Oh, Bashak, is that Bashak from Eskisha here? Before I start off, feel free, by the way, to chat away. I sometimes look at the chat and it's often more interesting than what I'm going to do. So we may go on a few tangents. Welcome, Bashak, lovely to see you. And if we do, don't worry, sometimes the tangents are more interesting than what I'm planning. And we all know as teachers that that even happens in our lessons. And this talk is partly about those kind of tangents as well. So let's just find out a few little things. Just feel free to type as little as possible in the chat box. But it's good to ask questions like, how much experience do you have? Because it just helps, oh, hey, Vinay, it helps us to see, it helps me to see kind of whether I'm working with very experienced teachers, mid-career teachers, or novice teachers. So just type something in the chat box if you can. 3 if you've got 3 years, 31. Thank you, Jody. Welcome, Jody. Oh, that's better. Jessica. Hey, Jessica. Angela, so welcome. 16 years, Angela. Brilliant. 5 years. So we're all pretty experienced colleagues. I quite like doing this. You can get a real rough idea of the kind of the excellent, welcome, Koheli. Of the different, hey, Kathy, of the different years of experience. It also lets some of us know our age, which isn't so good. Tell me about your main teaching context. And if you work in teacher education, just write something like CELTA trainer or whatever, or in-service teacher educator. Do you work in primary school, secondary, tertiary, or private? You can type A, B, C, or D if you've only got one hand available for the keyboard, got your other on a cup of tea or something like that. Excellent, good. Secondary, CELTA, business. Wow, a lot of people. How many? We got 63. Great. C and D. Thank you, Kathy. So that's tertiary and private. Okay. Okay, cool. Hey, Raju, welcome. Marie, welcome. Cool. Excellent. Nice variety, great. But mainly, I'm looking at it and it's mainly kind of, let me just scroll up again there as it slowed down. We're mainly talking about C and D in this talk, and it does vary. There's a few Bs, a few As, but it's good for me just to bear that in mind as I progress. And a question for you in terms of what you're doing in your work. Are you at the moment teaching online or face-to-face? Both from Trucy. Online, yeah, look at that. Still online for most. Some people here in London are moving back to teaching face-to-face. I know some of my colleagues are, but even they are still minority. Alexandra, that's good to see someone is. Well, hopefully we'll be teaching face-to-face soon, because I don't know about you, but online teaching for me is not the most enjoyable place to be. Great. Okay, Susan, taking a break. That's a good idea. Vinay, okay, you're on holidays there in Telangana. Great. Olga online. Great. Okay, and a much nicer question. Sorry if this question seems a bit strange, but sometimes it's good just to reflect on things like this. What do you like most about being a teacher? Holidays. Nice one, Mamata. I know. Where what are holidays? Students, yay, variety, energy. Every day is a different day, absolutely. Seeing the light go on. Yes, ideas, people, someone's ideas learning, there's something. Doing peaceful work, Matthew, blimey. Peaceful teaching. I suppose it is when you put the students on mute. Seeing the results, thank you, Matthew. Helen, aha moments. Lovely. Yes, Helen, aha moments. I like that. Experimenting, Vinay. Thank you. To these interactions. Brilliant. All good stuff. All good stuff. Made me smile anyway. Thank you, Lakshmi. Interactions with students. Excellent. Great. So let's go through the plan for the talk. I kind of thought of a name for the talk, and I know I don't have to. It sounds a little bit kind of like I'm doing some kind of input session on a course, but I thought of this, and so I thought I'd share it. I suppose the aim of this talk, it's the third time I've done it now, but I'm always kind of adapting it for the different contexts, and this one is a more generic one because we have people from so many different contexts around the world. To raise awareness of different frameworks, the tensions between these, and I'll explain what I mean, and potential ways these tensions can be resolved. So during the talk, the rough idea, we'll begin by exploring our preferences and just seeing what you guys are thinking at this stage in time. We'll look at some of the traditional frameworks for structuring lessons, for lesson planning. And then we'll look at what I've called responsive teaching approaches. Some of you may be very familiar with these, some of you less so. And so I'll give some examples when I do. And I'll indicate that there is a conflict between these and the so-called traditional frameworks. I'll introduce a bit of my recent research on the influence of coursebook design or coursebook curriculum, if you like, on lesson shapes. And then I'll talk a little bit about the two integrated skills framework that I've introduced, argued for, however you want to put it, CAP/CAPE and TATE as well. And then at the end, there'll be plenty of time for questions, discussion, and feel free to chuck a question at me at any point if something's not clear. I've got my chat over here, which is why my eyes keep going to the left there. So don't worry if I'm doing that. It's because I'm trying to see what people are thinking. Great. It's an interesting fact. Yesterday, I was reflecting with a colleague on when you're teaching online, it's so difficult to get feedback because that kind of interaction you get by looking at a room and seeing different eyes, doing different things, different faces, heads turning in different directions. It is very, very difficult when you're teaching online. And it's exactly the same, as I'm sure you'll agree, when you do these talks online. Okay, great. So there we go. If I go a bit fast at any point, feel free to slow me down. And Sean, feel free to switch your microphone off and mention to me if there's something important, someone that has a question that you think I need to answer along the way. I welcome the interruptions very much so. Great. So let's begin first of all with the very obvious question. What frameworks do you use for structuring your lessons? I'll give an example in a moment, but I want to just give a pregnant pause to see what people want to respond initially. TBL. And Margarida, when you say TBL, what do you mean by that? Morag, TTT. TTT, Marie. Thank you. And Marie and Morag, with TTT, do you use that for all lesson types? And Helen, is the dream. What do you mean by that, I wonder? Okay, interesting, Kathy. So you use 3, PPP, TTT, or GD. Kathy, I don't know what's GD. Test Teach says for listening, Olga. Thank you. Lena. And GD as well. Hang on, GD is a new one to me. See, oh, guided discovery. Okay, thank you. Brilliant. Great. Thank you, guys. I'm learning something if you're not. Great. Test features, test-based, great. Yes, thank you, Angelos. And this is one of the key points I'm going to be making. And Dogme as well. Now, Stephen, that's one of the ones I'll introduce as the more responsive approaches. Guided discovery. Text-based, Maria, I'm not going to touch on that much, but I will mention it towards the end a little bit. Vinay, no fixed plan, yes, and that will also come in useful as well. Brilliant, thank you guys. So we get a kind of some basic ideas there from people. I think we've kind of answered question 2, but feel free to just respond with that, respond to that if you want. I get the feeling that the majority, oh, Rob's a Dogme practitioner. Thank you, Rob. Rob, is it just Dogme? Are you an A, prefer to work only with the Dogme framework, or do you use a variety? And if some of you aren't familiar with some of the words that people are putting in the chat, I will explain some of them, if not all of them. Pre-while post, B for sure, yeah. And this is something which I think when we've got experienced practitioners as we have here, it's quite normal for people to work with more than one. And if B, which it is for most of you, what does your choice of framework depend upon? We've already had some answers to that, which I'm just going to scroll back up, see if I can find them. course books, Marie mentions that they're an influence, which is important, I think. And Angelos makes this key point. It depends on the lesson, the students, etc., and others. I'll just scroll down to the new messages. Yeah, teaching context and students, needs, wants, lacks. That's an interesting one. What's the opposite of wants? Yeah, depends on the teaching point, level of students, if you know the students. And when Rob says teaching point, that's a term which is sometimes used in the kind of CELTA Delta framework, i.e. the bit of language that you're teaching. And the level as well, exactly, yeah, great. So here are some of the considerations that you've already mentioned, I think. I'm just still reading. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Jody. Lesson type, obviously, vocabulary, grammar skills, learners, age groups, needs, expectations. And I'll come back to the links between the different framework and these things. Curriculum, including textbook, what is expected and why. When you work in a kind of a private TEFL context, it may often feel that the textbook itself is the curriculum, but in many kind of primary and secondary contexts, there's a separate curriculum that is often really important for influencing what we choose to teach and how. Student production, that's interesting, Stephen, thank you. And your own career stage. And those of us who work as teacher trainers at a kind of a pre-service level, yes, Marie's talking about demo lessons and demonstration lessons when you're training teachers as well. Your own career stage, I think, is a really important part of it. And here is a kind of an image kind of two of the questions that I sometimes hear from trainee teachers in a pre-service context. But I also remember myself back in 1996 when I was a trainee on a course at International House London, actually a CELTA course it was, my first experience of teaching. And all I wanted at that point was just one framework. And I had several great trainers, but often throwing a lot of different ideas in my direction and me often struggling to make sense of them all. And out of all of those, I found PPP. It was the one that seemed to make sense to me because it matched my prior experiences of learning something. And so I presumed that it would be appropriate for language teaching and learning. And we can discuss that important question a bit later. So there we go. All pretty obvious stuff for most of you, but if not, it hopefully is a useful recap. So let me talk a little bit about the so-called traditional choices. The traditional choices for structuring lessons, especially in private school TEFL. We've got things like the so-called receptive skills lesson structure, which can be called pre, during, post, or while instead of during. And it doesn't really have a very nice name, but the key point to this structure is you do something before the text, contextualization, pre-teaching lexis is often the thing, although the question as to whether that is a good idea is also up in the air now. During the text, very typically when you give learners comprehension questions, questions to check understanding, sometimes from global to specific, and then the post-text type of thing where there may be a focus on some important part of what was in the text, maybe language, but also discussion, interaction, possibly the students producing similar texts. The PPP framework, presentation, practice, production, I've put this in the traditional choices. It goes back to 1976, and I did some research on this recently, discovering that the origins of it is indeed in Don Byrne's work. But in one of the papers, I make the very important point that it does not come from before communicative language teaching. There's a lot of fiction in the 1980s, 90s, and even noughties, and even continuing today, that people seem to think it's behaviorist. It isn't. It originates actually even earlier in Julian Dakin's work, who worked with Stephen Pitt-Corder, who was one of the key figures in the development of communicative language teaching. And it's a model that accepts and recognizes the importance of learner error in terms of for their development, which is why it has a production phase. Production phase would not have been possible or permissible in a more structuralist, things like audiolingual type oral system approach. PPP as well, it tends to be a structure which is used much more for teaching grammar. And it's suited for teaching grammar because it's got the proceduralization phases that are necessary when we're dealing with the pronunciation or dealing with aspects of the syntax, the morphology of a new bit of grammar, before the freer production phase. It's a gradual stepping stone type phase. The next one down there, test, teach, test. If you're not familiar with it, test, teach, test, I personally hate the acronym because it doesn't sound right that a lesson should have two stages of testing. In a communicative language teaching world, the idea that we have a framework that describes itself in that way is strange. I sometimes wonder whether we should call it CCC, check, clarify, check, but it doesn't really work. And test, teach, test seems to be more popular and seems to also be more logical in terms of what we know about learning for teaching lexis, vocabulary. The idea is you're probably teaching a specific area of language, maybe to do with holidays or the environment, whatever. And at the start of the lesson, you check what the learners already know, i.e. formative assessment, diagnostic formative assessment, if you like, and then you teach. And of course, the teaching doesn't have to be, I explain all of the words, but we do some kind of activity in which learners fill in the gaps in their knowledge, followed by a final check at the end of the lesson, further formative assessment, to see the extent to which we've learned it. And it's one which is also working quite well in a lot of adult private school environments because it's quite an intensive framework, and a lot of students actually quite like the fact that it pushes them a lot. The test, teach, test framework, the origins of it are quite strange. It actually goes back to the 1920s, and it originates in special educational needs. And it was imported into ELT much more recently. It seems to start appearing in ELT context in the 1980s. But it's a bit of a kind of an enigma as to why that specific set of terms were chosen for that lesson structure. Always seems that threes catch on. If you look at the link at the bottom there, the slides, by the way, are already online on my website if you want to check out that link at the bottom, which goes over some of these. ESA, Jeremy Harmer's Engage, Study, Activate, from his book, How to Teach English in 1998. And in this model, Harmer very interestingly introduces not only phases which are to do with the learning of the language, but also the affective side of the learner, the idea of engaging them at the start of the lesson. It's one which is also quite popular on many courses, so that you begin by engaging the students in the lesson topic, then you study something, and then you activate what you've studied. The study is essentially analogous to the presentation and probably the practice of PPP, and then the activate is the bit of the lesson where you get the learners using the language in a freer speaking or writing activity. It is a popular model, but one trainee teacher once said to me something which I think is an important and a valid criticism of this model. Shouldn't all stages engage the learners? And I thought that trainee had a very important point. It's very difficult to do, but in theory, that's what we should be aiming to do throughout our lesson. And the argument could be that using engage and affective side in terms of structuring the lesson could be confusing categories, and that may sometimes lead people to misunderstand it, that maybe you engage them first and then you just teach them any old bit of grammar and get them using it. And then this Jim Scrivener's model there, ARC, authentic practice, restricted practice, clarification. That was very popular back when I did my course, but it's lost popularity over the last 10 to 15 years. But the three phases there are basically the same as PPP. Clarification is the presentation, restricted practice is the practice, and authentic practice is the production. And in Scrivener's model, he argues you can change the order of them. They're essentially not necessarily sequential phases, but different things that we do in lessons. And interestingly, the PPP model itself, Don Byrne, in his second edition of Teaching Oral English, the book which introduced it, he argued that PPP could be a cycle, so that a lesson could start with production, followed by presentation and practice, which is an interesting point when we think about the more responsive approaches that I'm going to go on about. So a key question here, and this is one of those kind of annoying questions where I think I know the answer, but you might provide an answer that's more interesting. I've got an answer in mind. In your opinion, what do all of these have in common? Yeah, some of you thought, oh, I wouldn't ask any more questions. Engage, practice, production. They definitely do to some extent. Yeah, they intend to support learning. Very true, Helen, very general though. Teacher-centered. What do you mean by that, Trucy? Three phases, yep, they'll come in threes, they do, yep. Teach, clarify, and practice, yep. There is teaching, there's some kind of input and some kind of practice opportunity for all of them. Although in test, teach, test, I'm not sure whether practice is clear there. Control by the teacher, okay. Yeah, I would argue that in any lesson, what's happening is to some extent controlled by the teacher. The question is the degree to which you're giving autonomy to the students or taking it back. Too much teaching, Eleanor? Thank you. I'm going to keep my opinion neutral there on that kind of question of teacher versus student-centered. And I'm going to give you the answer that I had in mind. Definitely a lot of them do have a kind of an input, some kind of new language followed by production, but not necessarily PPP, sorry, TTT. The thing that they definitely do all have in common is what you might call, and what SLA researchers would call, a synthetic curriculum, i.e. the idea that there is a language focus that is pre-planned and is specific. Specific is the synthetic part of it, that you've got a curriculum, you've separated out the bits, and you're deciding in which order you're going to teach them. So on Monday, we'll do past simple, Tuesday present perfect, Wednesday we'll compare them, Thursday, and so on and so forth. You get the point. Or with Lexis, you can do the same, and even pronunciation teaching. But all of these share a very important set of commonalities in so much as they fit into a synthetic curriculum framework. And this is something which some researchers would argue is not a good idea to do with language learning and teaching. Notice I'm kind of saying some researchers. I'm not necessarily saying that that is my opinion. Right. Rod Ellis indeed uses the term structural when he talks about these kind of frameworks. He would say that they are structural frameworks, particularly PPP, and he also uses the term task supported to talk about some structural frameworks. So a number of the researchers working in the area of second language acquisition, I'll use the term SLA, and methodologists, they emphasize the importance of avoiding over-planning our language focus in a lesson. They argue that rather than me pre-planning what bit of language we'll focus on today, we should get the learners to use the language meaningfully, in other words, to do an activity. The word task is often used, but that word is used in so many different ways today. And our input should be responsive to what happens next, i.e. the emergent language, the internal syllabus of the learner. And the term internal syllabus is used by some SLA researchers to refer to the fact that there is quite a lot of research, I wouldn't say it's conclusive, but indicating quite strongly that many learners seem to have a natural progression when it comes to learning grammar that doesn't seem to be very amenable to our attempts to change that with a synthetic curriculum. Experienced teachers, we all know this. There's no point in teaching someone the past perfect until they learn the present perfect. But the internal syllabus rule also applies to more complex bits of morphology, things like learning negatives and question forms and learning certain morphemes, such as why do they always learn the third person S very late, even though it's an easy one to teach and they can understand it early on. Apologies if you're hearing any noise, there's some building work happening above. So yes, so the whole emergent syllabus question is a very, very important one in the work of Mike Long, who unfortunately died recently. Rest in peace, Mike, we're still talking about your work. And Mike Long talked about the importance of what he called focus on form. What he meant by that was, as learners are interacting using the language, any focus on the form of the language during the meaningful usage is more likely to lead to learning, and they would use the word acquisition in this context, than a focus on form which is conducted before that. And confusingly, Mike Long called that other type, i.e. the pre-active focus on form before the learners are using it. He called that focus on forms with an S. It's not very clear, the difference, I know, but those were his terms. A lot of you are probably familiar with DogMe or Teaching Unplugged. Luke Meddings and Scott Thornbury have written a bit about this, so the reference I'll show you at the end. And this believes in the idea that you, as the teacher, you don't take anything to the lesson. You allow the learners during the lesson to bring along what they want, and you allow the lesson to emerge out of the learner's ideas, background, beliefs. In other words, it's a highly constructivist approach. It builds on what the learners bring with them and ensures that what is dealt with in the lesson, what we teach in terms of themes, in terms of interests, as well as in terms of language, is responsive to the learner's interests and needs. Then we've got this idea of dealing with affordance, which is something I've written about recently. And by affordance, I suppose we mean learning opportunities in the lesson. And if you've got a chance to look at the reference, you'll find it in EOT Journal, that one. Or dealing with what's sometimes called emergent language. And the reference there is to a talk by Nick Andon and Danny Norrington Davis from King's College London. A very interesting one about emergent language. And we've got some of our colleagues from IH London here. I know Melly is here. I'm not sure if anyone else is. Melly Lamb. And a lot of those guys there are doing some work on dealing with emergent language, which includes a whole range of things that teachers, experienced teachers, we all probably do it when something comes up in a lesson. helping learners to develop, to progress to the next level of their own development, such as by offering alternatives for vocabulary, by providing a little bit of correction, by providing the kind of interaction that helps learners to realize maybe that what they've said is ambiguous and needs some help. Can't hear it here. Sean, was that is that a problem that you can't hear me? Anyway, I'm sure Sean will get back to me.
Oh no, sorry, we can't hear the building work.
Oh, okay, great.
All good. Carry on as you were.
It's great when a conversation doesn't work, isn't it, like that? Yeah, that's an example of negotiation of meaning, which is dealing with emergent language. Yeah, there we go, great. And of course, this is the primary basis on which many people argue for task-based approaches to language teaching. And there's several different models. Jane Willis has kind of got one of the most teacher-friendly ones in the sense that it states the different stages. And these I've classed together under responsive teaching. One of the interesting things is that TBLT is now as old as communicative language teaching, essentially. The first kind of experiments in this were happening in the 1970s in India with Prabhu in the Bangalore project, the communicational language teaching project, and they continue to this day. There's plenty of teachers, as we've seen, who are involved in and using TBLT. So just to contrast those two, you've got these kind of two approaches, and Mike Long was very, very insistent in his belief that responsive approaches, the type of task-based language teaching that he was in favor of, is incompatible with a PPP type approach and with a synthetic curriculum. So here's a question which I want to ask you as experienced colleagues, and it's one which I'm very much interested in your opinions about, so feel free to type away and we'll just have a read of each other's ideas. Are more traditional approaches, and let's take those three examples, PPP, ESA, and TTT, are they incompatible with this responsive teaching view? Do you agree with Mike Long that they are, or would you say that they are compatible? And feel free to just type whatever you want to say in that chat box. I'm not sure if it would work, but you might even want to unmute yourself and somebody might try and say something. We'll see if that works. If they can, I'm not sure. Melissa, they are compatible. Tweaks. Helen, what tweak would you make? They don't have to be. Vicky, that's ambiguous. Not completely incompatible. It's interesting, this commentating that I'm doing here, isn't
it? It's actually a good thing, the commentating for the recording. That's something that's very much. But at the same time, it's good to attend in person, isn't it? So, you know, there's always that added value of reading the chat.
Yeah. Oh, I see, because the chat may not come up in the recording.
It won't come up. No, the chat won't come up.
Read out some of these comments. So Marie's saying it depends. Sorry to interrupt you, Scott. Marie's saying it depends if you stick wholly to what is in the book or you encourage students to supply their own forms. So, for example, if you're doing an activity where you want the students to do a role play, and you expect them to stick to what is in the book. And this is what some people criticize PPP for, that it forces them to stick with what's in the book or what's in the curriculum, as opposed to the idea that you actually encourage students to be more creative with the language. Compatible, Angela says. Rob Wood, potentially, but doesn't have to be. Eclectic, yeah, Margarita, this will be kind of one of the key points I'll obviously come back to. Okay, PPP is Vinay thinks. Depends on the student's needs and levels. And Jessica, absolutely true. Yeah, rigid adherence to any framework discourages them from responding. Yeah. Oh, thank you, Olga. That's a really important question. Olga's asking that with a winky emoji. I think she knows the answer. Therefore, when it comes to Lexis, learners learning, all of the evidence points to the fact that they don't necessarily need to follow an internal syllabus. In other words, if we teach vocabulary, when we teach vocabulary, learners can seem to learn what we teach when we teach it and retain it if we teach it well. So all of the stuff about the internal syllabus, the natural order of acquisition in that body of SLA research doesn't hold true, at least according to Paul Nation, one of the leading authorities, and a lot of research studies that have been conducted, doesn't seem to hold true for Lexis. And that's a really important point, because Lexis for many of us is as important as this teaching grammar. And therefore, those kind of the arguments underpinning TBLT from that perspective don't necessarily hold true for Lexis. And the lexical approach itself, well, interestingly, I could have mentioned some of the other frameworks. There's one by Michael Lewis, observe, hypothesize, experiment, which came out of the lexical approach. But importantly, Michael Lewis was saying with that framework, not that it's how we should structure our lesson, but he was using it to describe the learning process from the individual learner perspective. And he didn't really ever elaborate on it enough for us to make it into a framework. And yes, thank you, Rob. Paul Nation's work, really interesting. Some good books out there, definitely. Cool. Okay, how are we doing for time? Halfway through. So several considerations to bear in mind. I think some of you have discussed these already in the chat. So I was gonna get some water, actually. I forgot to bring some with me. Knowledge experience as a teacher. And it's important when we're doing, so Dublin TEFL, who run CELTA, Delta, DIP TESOL, CERT TESOL, depending on which level we're at, often, and it's not always true, at CELTA, CERT TESOL level, teachers, I think, are often allowed to stick to much more structural frameworks and not necessarily expected, even though some courses encourage a more experimental lesson, which might be DOGME, TBLT. The majority of their training will involve those kind of structural frameworks. And some people would argue there's a kind of a continuum that as at the start of our career, we start with these structural frameworks, and then we move on to more responsive approaches. The question mark in the middle is to denote the fact that sometimes it can be difficult to know how you get from one to the other, because essentially they're oppositional. Teaching language before learners use it, or getting learners to use it and then teaching language. Another important point as well is that if English isn't your first language, or if you have a lower level of proficiency in English as a teacher, it's very, very difficult to do responsive approaches, because sometimes you don't know what language to provide and you may need to train up in that. It's an important fact to note that the majority of teachers of English around the world are primary and secondary teachers. And in many of these countries, we know that average levels of proficiency are about B1, sometimes B2 among those teachers. Those are the norms for many teachers of English around the world. And so those responsive frameworks are going to be pretty difficult to use if you yourself don't have confidence in those languages. I can think of several languages I know, like say French, which I would find it horrific, the idea of teaching some grammar responsive to the learner's challenges, because I might get it wrong and I might teach them the wrong bit of language, and it's something that we often overlook. Learners' age and needs are important. A very important point to remember is that very young learners, under say 7 or 8, don't really learn grammar according to explicit rules. In fact, they can't. They learn language meaningfully in context, and therefore sometimes even completely different approaches to the ones that we're discussing here will work, but certainly task-based works at younger age groups. Teens and adults do or can learn language according to explicit instruction, but it depends. Certain factors influence their ability to do this. Some students are much better at learning it. What we call their grammatical inferencing ability is an important factor here. And also very important to remember that when you're teaching a large class, within that large class, different students will be at different stages in terms of their readiness for a bit of structure. Expectations of you. Many teachers around the world work to a national curriculum, and that is a very important factor. Their students are expected to prepare for and to get through an exam where they have to demonstrate that explicit knowledge, and that explicit knowledge is surely better facilitated with a framework that focuses on the specific elements of it, i.e. a synthetic curriculum, although some people might disagree with me on that. And what you're teaching. All learners seem to be able to learn Lexis according to a synthetic curriculum, and there's the point, Olga, but it's much more complex for grammar learning. Right, and Vinay's got an interesting point here. Yeah, it's interesting, Vinay, about the belief system. What Prabhu called the sense of plausibility, I think, is a really important point here. We tend to teach using a framework that we believe reflects how we individually have learned languages in the past. And that's definitely true of me. So I'm going to move on a little bit now just to talk about some of the research I did a few years ago on how global coursebooks introduce new language. I'm going to zoom through this mainly because of time, but feel free to ask any questions if you want to. I looked at all the coursebooks you can see on the screen, and these are all global coursebooks from 1986 right up to 2013. And I think there hasn't been much change since 2013, but feel free to make a point in the chat if you disagree with the point I'm going to make in a moment. And all of these course books, when they teach new language, they don't follow PPP, they don't follow TBLT, they don't follow test, teach, test, because they almost always begin with context. Now, that might be your receptive skills framework, but in fact, it's more than that, because the context nearly always relates to the new language that's introduced. Melissa's getting nostalgic there about True to Life, one of those old textbooks. I used to like Language in Use, and everyone hated that one. Anyway, 4 types of context I identified in this research. Image-supported context, where at the start of, before a piece of language, learners use images alone or images and text to understand it. In other words, for example, as a teacher, you might come into the room with some images of before and after, and you could use those images to teach new language. Wasn't very common in the coursebooks, actually. Text integrated, where there's a text that learners have to manipulate in some way, for example, by completing it, by ordering bits of a text, such as sentences, also not very common. Extensive text, where learners read or listen to a text. For example, an article, an interview, and I made a division of over 100 words constituted what I called an extensive text. The new language in the text is then noticed and analyzed. And then there was a few examples where there was no clear context. The language was presented independently of any of the previous 3 types of context. And what did I find? Well, the research was quite clear. It wasn't a massive sample, but there's a very clear pattern there that back in the 1980s and 90s, image-supported context was quite common, and text-integrated was more common as well. Whereas as we pass from the new century, 2000 onwards, you see a predominance of extensive texts. And in something like the National Geographic book, Life, you see that, in fact, these are very long texts, often preceding quite a small focus on grammar. And yet there's a large number of people arguing, a large number of people, Barry Tomlinson does it, Jeff Jordan has done it, arguing wrongly that textbooks are still following a PPP model. They're not. This isn't PPP. It's a very different type of model. So this is an important point that I think has been neglected. And let's have a look at some examples of this. Here's an example from an elementary course book. You've got your context at the start there. Then there's your grammar, your analysis, and there's your practice. And these are the 3 stages that we see over and over again in textbooks. Yes, you can definitely see that there's the elements of PPP there, analysis and practice, but the context itself, in the eyes of most of us as teachers, is a really, really important part of the analysis. So in other words, it provides new language. You'll nearly always find that new language in the context, and it will be noticed, as many SLA researchers argue it should be, and then analyzed in that context. And often you'll find before the context, you'll have a little bit of a lexical focus as well, which is something common in course books. Let's have a look at another example. So that's a global course book. Here's an example from a national level course book from one country around the world. You've got a context there, then you've got a bit of analysis of, in that case, it's the first and second conditional, and then you've got your practice section. And typically, this is a secondary learner course book. You'll find there's a little bit less of the freer practice in state school context because of the challenges we often have, and I felt it myself as a secondary teacher, of getting speaking practice working effectively in a class where learners all share languages other than English. So because of this, the prevalence of this context analysis and practice stages, I proposed this model, not as a model as to how we should teach, but as a model of exactly what's actually happening in course books today. And not just in course books, you see it even in all kinds of other materials that are being used at university level. Context analysis practice is the dominant paradigm in language teaching today, not PPP, not TBLT. I added on the evaluation phase because I know, especially CELTA trainers who are here, a lot of the time, a lot of teachers at the end of that practice phase will often conduct some kind of evaluation towards the end of the lesson. But I put it in that kind of dotted box because it wasn't really always present in the coursebook material, in the curriculum-based material that I was looking at. And so I included it as a possible option, a CAPE, in addition to the CAP. You get the idea of the 3 stages. I won't read through them all because of time, but that was the basic idea of the CAP model. And I'll just show a few very obvious examples of this from a book I wrote a few years ago called the Cert TESOL Companion for the Trinity course there. So it could be, for example, a lesson on making arrangements by email, a lesson on telling an anecdote, or a business lesson on negotiating a business contract. All 3 of those lessons could quite typically have a context analysis practice shape. And it could be, of course, the extensive text context, but there's nothing stopping us from using other types of context as well. So in the intermediate one, they may begin by reading and evaluating different emails. Then they study the structure of the better email, and then we get learners to write emails to each other. A very familiar lesson stage. I'm sure we'll all know it, but notice that has the 3 distinct phases: context, analysis, and practice. Then the upper intermediate one, students may listen to people talking about something, analyze the language they use when doing it, and then practice doing it themselves. And then with the business one, you may have a video context that they watch some kind of interaction on video, and then make notes on techniques used, and then do something similar to the interaction that they've seen in the context phase. 3 examples of what I've called lesson skeletons using the CAP model there. So there we go. The CAP framework, I didn't ever present it as what I perceive to be a best practice model, simply a reflection of what we do and what is common in the world today. Do you have example for elementary level? Yeah, Margarita, well, if you look at the slides, the images from textbooks that I showed earlier, the first one is an elementary one, and that gives you an example of a lesson on the topic of family, which has context analysis practice. But if you look at an elementary textbook, you should see a similar structure to most units, both national and international kind of weak communicative language teaching course books. So the advantages of this CAP model as an alternative to things like PPP and ESA as a structural model, it still does fall under those, is it's simple and clear. It's directive, but with flexibility. And many of us have used the CAP model on pre-service courses to help trainees. Good question from Marie there. How does it differ from text-based presentation and practice? That phrase, text-based presentation, is sometimes used a lot of the time by CELTA trainers, and it doesn't. It's exactly the same thing. But text-based presentation, or new language from a text, is essentially what a lot of trainers on CELTA courses propose as an alternative to the other lesson types. The interesting thing is that textbooks nearly always do text-based presentations, and therefore it's the CAP stages, context analysis practice. But the key difference in the framework CAP and text-based presentation is that the context in text-based presentation is text. Whereas in the CAP framework, I argue that it can actually be any type of context. The fact that using images or using manipulable text or using other kinds of context, such as a classroom situation, if anybody remembers that from the 1980s, that was quite a common way of introducing new language. The teacher comes into the lesson, pretends they're sick, and that provides the context for new language where the students give the teacher advice. But the key point being that it doesn't have to be text, and therefore the word context, I thought, was a more appropriate term to text analysis practice. But my mind changed on that a little bit for reasons which I'll go into in a moment. So thank you, Marie, really important point. So the CAP model is consistent with the structure of most textbooks. It prioritizes context, and the other models don't. It makes for rounded lessons in the sense that you have receptive, followed by analysis, and then productive. So it's an integrated skills model. And this is why textbooks use it, I'm sure. It provides the input and it provides the production. And it does so in an order which is fairly logical for most of us in terms of, well, if they've had input of it, they should be able to produce something similar. It's useful for CELTA and Cert TESOL pre-service observation supervisions because you can often do several things in one lesson. Whilst in reality, it's very difficult to do all 3 of these phases in, say, a 20-minute trial lesson that a trainee is doing. If somebody's got a longer lesson, they can show their ability to do both input and productive skills work. So receptive skills and productive skills, sort of. Yeah, so there are some advantages to this CAP model, but I just want to offer the question here, any disadvantages in your opinions? Those of you who are familiar with this model, because it is out there very often, and those of you for whom it's new, can you think of any problems, any issues about this CAP model? I intimated towards one of them just a moment ago, actually. I'll just wait to see if you've got any thoughts. Although Sean says it's good to keep commentating if the chat isn't available in a video that appears later. Wait time. That time. Oh, I think we got a point from Marie there. Curriculum is synthetic. Of course it is. It follows a synthetic model. Yeah, absolutely, Alexander. And this is an interesting thing why I think CAP is useful on pre-service courses, that it makes the context important. And if you have a model that doesn't emphasize context, like PPP, students may start off by walking into the class, writing a sentence on the board, and presuming that that is sufficient context. Not enough time left for practice. Yeah, Morag. And also, I think the word practice might be problematic as well. Yeah, and Anna, we need to mix it up. If it gets too boring, because it's everywhere. Thank you, Alexandra. Yeah, exactly, same point. And then difficult to engage low proficient learners. This is from Vinay Rad, who works in Telangana in secondary education. And there definitely, it's very, very difficult if students don't have much English to use, for example, a text-based context to engage them. I agree with that, yeah. Yeah, exactly, Teresa. And this was one of the concerns that PPP or ARC do have a separation between the more controlled practice and the freer practice, which if you as a teacher or teacher educator want to promote that, it's very, very important. And again, Isa, not much room for emergent language. Thank you, guys. And Faiza, very true. Some of your colleagues have just said that a bit further up, but to some extent, students will often find the same structure too predictable. Well, here's one example. I know you won't be able to read the pages, but this is a typical secondary course book from around the world. And
yeah,
got someone on someone's microphone isn't on mute there. Who is that? Is that Ree? Right.
Sorry.
Thanks, Ree.
Welcome, Ree. So one of the issues with CAP is that the CAP unit is not in one lesson. In this course, but you can see the first page is actually the pre-context warm-up. The context would then take probably a lesson. The analysis happens in two different phases in probably subsequent lessons, especially if you're teaching 45-minute lessons, which is the norm in secondary education. And then the practice tends to come out in a lump at the end in this particular course book, or it might actually happen in separate sections. So you could argue that the CAP model isn't necessarily a model for one lesson. It seems to be a longer term model. And I personally found that there were three issues with CAP as I was using it myself and as I was discussing it with colleagues. The first one is this idea that units are usually longer than one lesson. It doesn't provide a clear opportunity for teachers to respond to learning, a point that somebody's already just made there. Isa makes the point. How do we deal with emergent language? And exactly as some of you have mentioned, the word practice is problematic. Do we want them simply to practice, or do we want them to use language meaningfully to communicate? The practice idea is something that Rod Ellis has criticized, that their language use will be much more limited if they perceive we only want them to practice one bit of language. So as a result of that, sorry, no, just a little kind of reflection here. In PPP, you tend to start with language analysis followed by language practice. TBLT flipped that on its head. And when Jane Willis, for example, was introducing it in the late 1990s, a lot of the teachers she was working with were very surprised that she was suggesting that they should start with a meaningful task followed by a language focus, because for most of us, that seems to be the wrong way around. But in my experience, what many experienced teachers do is both. They start with pre-task or pre-language use activity, focus on language. There's a meaningful opportunity for language use, and then there is often some kind of language analysis afterwards. And one of the CELTA trainers, Judy Hudson, I don't know if Judy's with us in Australia, it's still very early in the morning there, or middle of the night, I think, isn't it? She used to talk about, when I was working with her in Egypt, a PACS, post-activity correction stage. And on many pre-service courses, we do something where we get the trainees to work on, after the students have done a lesson, or done a practice activity rather, to get them to focus on bits of language that they felt the students need help with. But of course, many experienced teachers do much larger variety of different activities after the activity itself. Yes, exactly, Angelos. Angelos, you've just perfectly anticipated what I'm going to introduce. Angelos's point here, isn't it more productive if we view CAP as a framework itself for the syllabus design? And that's why I kind of asked myself the question, well, if we brought this together with what we know about practice on emergent language, what would that syllabus design framework look like? It would have to be a bit more complex because it isn't just a lesson, it's a framework that needs all of these elements, all 4 elements. There needs to be some kind of input or context, there needs to be some kind of language focus, there needs to be some kind of practice, and there needs to be something afterwards. And that's why last year I introduced, in response to a piece that Rod Ellis wrote that I felt was badly theorized. Rod Ellis was arguing for a synthetic a hybrid curriculum that included task-based and task-supported learning. I responded to that with the suggestion of this framework, which I call TATE. And you can straight away see that the basic elements from the CAP framework are there, but I've renamed it. And Marie, you'll notice I've actually gone for text rather than context, simply because a text provides an opportunity for receptive skills input, either listening or reading. And text could be either a listening text or a reading text or a video text as well, followed by analysis, task, and I've used the word task rather than practice because I think today we often see the word task as being related more to meaningful language use, and then exploration. So I argue in the paper that I introduced that it's a hybrid framework, what Rod Ellis would call a task-supported framework, but I also argue it can be used for task-based as well, because the analysis doesn't have to be predictive of the language used in the task. The analysis could focus singularly on the text, and the task itself doesn't necessarily have to have the same kind of language focus. And in that sense, it would meet the criteria for a task-based activity or lesson. It provides scaffolding to help novice teachers move from the pre-task analysis to post-task. In other words, the TATE model includes both, and therefore it provides a bridge for somebody who's used to using PPP type frameworks to being able to then do the language analysis afterwards. And as teachers gain experience and gain confidence in using English, they are more likely to be able to deal with the post-task analysis. It's capable of facilitating both explicit and implicit learning, and I won't go into too much detail here, but in the paper, I'll show you in a moment some of the different elements that are there. And it allows for a flexible form focus within the constraints of typical curricula. The vast majority of us around the world are expected to work with synthetic curricula, and therefore a curriculum design framework, in my opinion, has to involve all of these. Phenomenon-based learning. Anna, can I be honest? I've never heard of that. Can you provide us with a link? I bet other people are interested as well.
I'm recording.
Oh, someone else is unmuted as well. Lorenzo, I think it's you. Yes, and it can be responsive to content focus, instructional constraints, learners' needs, and teachers' preferences. In other words, some teachers may want to do the pre-task analysis, some teachers may want to do the post-task exploration. What do I mean by these different phases? So I'm not going to read this all out aloud. I'm just going to allow you to read it and just be silent myself for a moment so we can listen to somebody else who has unmuted themselves. But you get the point about the 4 stages. There's a task, a text at the start, which links into the analysis through what I've called noticing. Not I've called, it's a well-known idea in second language acquisition research. Different types of proceduralization activities, and in contexts where learners are working in a complex multilingual classroom, translanguaging is also going to be likely here. Then the task could include a range of different implicit processes, negotiation of meaning, automation, pushed output, and then the exploration can include things like evaluation, a review of what we've learned in the lesson, what we've done, a form focus that's responsive to the task success and the task challenges. And then there are explicit processes that can also take place at each of these stages that link the 4 stages together. So in the sense that Angelos nicely set up there, this is, in my opinion, much more a curriculum design framework than, and this was, of course, how I entitled the paper in which I presented it, than simply CAP. It's responsive to what actually is there in the course book, but it has a little bit more theory underpinning it. And I'm offering it more as a best practice, flexible, best practice has to be flexible because we all live and work in different contexts, and yet never universal. I'm not suggesting all lessons need to follow this structure, but it's got flexibility depending on the length of time, how long you would do a TATE framework. Could be in some teachers work in contexts where their lessons are a morning's learning in intensive language teaching context, 2 or 3 hours. And then you could have the whole, all 4 phases there. For other teachers who have just 2 English lessons a week, this could take a month to pass through a whole TATE framework. You get the point. It's hopefully a curriculum design framework. And then we've got a link there to the phenomenal education there that we can all click on. Not now, well, you can click on it now, but don't read it now. Well, you can do, I don't care. So emergent curriculum. Susan, this is one of the points that I'm arguing for, that if you're interested in building on learners' emergent language, that happens during the exploration phase. And then that's the phase there where you respond to the learners' emergent language, you engage them in discussion about maybe a bit of lexis they were interested in, a bit of lexis they needed. You look at that on the board, you get learners possibly even to use it there. And there's an opportunity there to deal with the emergent language there. So that's the thought. Darren, that's a really interesting point. A dot, or maybe that was an emoji that didn't work. Right, okay, we're coming to the end of 5 minutes left. Hopefully there'll be time for a few questions, so get them ready. Beyond frameworks, now, most of the people in this webinar, I think, will be aware that as we gain expertise, the need for frameworks is often placed by more instinctual approaches. Widdowson called it principled eclecticism. Kumaravadivelu called it post-method pedagogy. And things like project-based learning, text-based learning, not so much new language from a text, but a different approach, which originates in Australia, text-based language teaching, but it follows a similar TATE type framework. CLIL and ESP frameworks are more likely to be of use. And Penier has this term mix and match that she uses in an article from 2011, where we as teachers are flexible. And already at the start of this webinar, many of you guys are, but it's important to recognize that many of the teachers we work with may not be so flexible. In other words, they may be dogmatic believers in one approach to doing it. So, macro strategies. Yeah, Matthew's referring to a term that Kumaravadivelu uses in his post-method pedagogy, which is useful. And so here we go, basic summary of what we've been through. So we looked at some of the traditional structural frameworks. I then argued that there is a conflict between those and the responsive teaching approaches, at least in some people's perceptions, and Mike Long was one of them, who believed they were fundamentally incompatible. My research on the influence of coursebook design suggests that all of these overlook a very important part of what happens in lesson naturally, and that is that context typically precedes introduction of new language in structural frameworks. Therefore, I proposed CAP, and therefore I modified it to TATE to make it more in line with the opportunity to deal with emergent language, to respond to learning as it happens in the E of the TATE phase. And this possible idea of a continuum as we develop, deliberate structured planning for novice teachers tends to become more responsive with experience and expertise. Although we always have to be aware of the fact that context and learner needs will be key considerations in our choice of approach. And in that sense, you could see the TATE framework as kind of a scaffolding tool to move between from one to the other. Or you could see it, as I've just morphed the screen there, as some kind of weird lesson framework that's attempting to take over the world. It looks like an aggressive state in this picture, doesn't it? TATE, no, that's not what I'm intending by the TATE model, by the way. But the key point about it is that it allows for a range of different approaches in teaching. So there we go. Thanks for coming, Nick. Good to see you. Yeah. Here are some of the references that I've mentioned in the talk, a few of those of mine at the start, some of them from EOT Journal. All of them should be accessible except for the TESOL Companion. If you go to my website, to the publications page and click directly on the title, even on pay to view articles, it should take you automatically through as if by magic. And the TATE model there is 2020A, Curriculum Design Framework, which was a EOT Journal point counterpoint writing piece that I engaged in with Rod Ellis. That was great fun. And Rod Ellis responded and I responded as well. All of those you should be able to find there. And if you can't get any, just drop me an email. So we've got a few minutes left. Not much, 3 minutes, 4 minutes. Maybe we can stay a bit longer.
If you're around, Jason, yeah, by all means.
I'm fine. I'm around.
Yeah.
I've nothing
we'll
to
certainly
do.
Keep the room open for Q&A. Before we do, let me just say thank you so much for such an engaging talk and coming along and sharing your expertise. Looking forward very much to having you along again soon. Jason's one of our guest experts on the Trinity DIP TESOL that we run at Dublin TEFL. So yeah, we're looking forward to your the private audience with Jason Anderson as well later on this month. Right, I'm going to stop recording. So if anyone does, feel like switching on the videos and their microphones and putting questions to Jason, yeah, we'll keep this room open for the next 10 minutes. All right.
Yeah, great.
Thanks, Jason.
Great.